Okay, hey everybody, we're going to go over this week's assignment. So let me share my screen here. My computer is acting a little buggy, so bear with me if this gives us trouble. All right, so today we're going to be going over for this week in the class a pretty cool class exercise that's going to allow you to use the information that you've went over in weeks 2 and 3 with regards to habeas corpus and due process in the form of the Matthews versus Eldridge case. And hopefully you all pulled the balancing test out of that case, which was important from the holding. And we're going to use this today in a totally different type of case with regard to the war on terror after 9/11. So I'm going to go over some things with you and explain the class exercise that we're going to do this week, which I think you'll have fun with. But before I jump into that, let me just cover a couple of other things that you have to know for this exercise first. So first, I'm going to go into a little bit Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution and the role of the executive branch. Okay, so what I want you to know from that is that Article 2 of the Constitution provides under Section 1 that essentially the executive power of the United States is vested in the President of the United States of America. And the limit to that power, of course, is that they're subject to election. And also relevant is under Article 2, Section 2, the President serves as the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the service of the United States. So basically, the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces. All right. Okay, so we have that from Article 2 with that understanding. And if you remember reading it all the way at the beginning of the course, reading Federalist number 78, it was argued essentially that the judicial branch should be the least threatening branch of the government because it had neither the power of the pen nor the power of the sword. The president, in the president's commander-in-chief power, has that power of the sword because they're the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces. The Congress has the power of the purse because they are the source where spending bills originate from. So we shouldn't feel that threatened by the power of the third branch of government, okay, the courts or the judiciary system. Well, now we're going to see the interplay of the courts. We've known the courts have gotten powerful in the wake of the Marbury versus Madison decision and judicial review. But we're going to look at how the courts and the checks and balances work in practicality. And you had a fairly routine benefits case where due process was an issue. But guess what? And I'm going to spot you this for this exercise. That holding, okay, that same test, the precedent that comes from that case, would be the same due process analysis that you would apply in a case as dramatic as this that I'm going to give you to decide yourselves that relates to the war on terror. Okay, so now that you know a little bit more about Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, let's just review really quick the Fifth Amendment. Okay, so remember that in relevant part, the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution states that no person shall be deprived of their life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So for due process, you'll see that appear in the Constitution under the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And later you'll see that there's another due process clause that comes in under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. In the shorthand of the course, we'll say that the Fifth Amendment will apply to violations of due process by the federal government. And on the 14th, it states that no state shall deprive of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So it applies our due process protections out to the 50 states as well. Okay, so have that in your mind when you decide this case, and also habeas corpus from your week 2 materials. Okay, so take a look at that and re-review yourself. If that takes you a moment, you can pause the video and go back. So what we're going to be doing this week, okay, and this is going to be our graded discussion, but we're going to place ourselves in the role of the Supreme Court of the United States deciding Hamdi versus Rumsfeld. So our class exercise in learning more about the realities of due process in the 21st century, we're going to go back in time and we're going to place ourselves in the position of the United States immediately after the attacks of 9/11. And ironically enough, for some of your classes, this 9/11 may be in the week that you end up studying this case and deciding this case. So let's pretend, okay, that we are 20 some years back in history and these cases didn't unfold and we don't necessarily know what we do now. Okay, so by the way, don't go look up the case if you don't know the result already. So I'm looking for your analysis and how you would decide it. That's the point of the exercise, but we're going to give you the tools. So we had the September 11th attacks, and then later the president was authorized under a use of military force act to take action against some of the forces that were blamed for the September 11th attacks on the country. And you know that when you're dealing with terrorists, it's not like there were two armed nations in conflict with one another, where you have uniformed soldiers and the Geneva Conventions and all of those type of things that would apply to prisoners of war. If you had nation states that were in combat with one another that also signed conventions like the Geneva Convention as to how prisoners of war would be treated. Well, when you're dealing with terrorists that are not affiliated with and under the flag of a foreign nation, that status is not determined, for example, by a treaty or convention. So how do you deal with these people? Okay, so let's take a look at that and how might we deal with that. Now, for the purpose of this exercise, we're going to place ourselves into the role of the United States Supreme Court. So for this week, I am conferring on you honorary Supreme Court justice statuses, and you're going to review the facts of the case, and you're going to decide the case according to the relevant law. And the relevant law, in part, in our case, in the most chief part of the case, is going to be the analysis that you've learned from your briefs of Matthews versus Eldridge. So let's go over the facts that you'll need, okay? And I'm going to be looking for you to decide this in your initial reply to the discussion. You're going to answer my questions. You're going to provide your analysis as if you were one of the Supreme Court justices. And then you're going to get to review the opinions of the other justices as the way that this case would go when you get to see the replies of everybody else once you've submitted your replies. And then you're going to try to persuade your classmates. Maybe if they don't hold your viewpoint, maybe you try to persuade them to change their position, argue for your analysis versus theirs. So we're essentially going to simulate a case conference of the U.S. Supreme Court when we do this. Maybe you want to reply to somebody that agrees with you, why you're decision would concur with theirs, or anything else, another factor that you have to add to their analysis, like you would in a concurring opinion with somebody else. But essentially, we're going to do a case conference, and I'll play the role of the Chief Justice. And don't worry, I won't make any of you write the decision, but that's what would actually happen once we get a vote of the other justices. And if we get a majority vote, then somebody would be assigned to write the majority opinion. Now, I'm not going to do that to you, but you're going to write what your suggested opinion on the matter would be. And I hope to see in there that you're applying the correct balancing, i.e. the correct rule of law, which is the balancing test articulated in Matthews versus Eldridge. It's going to be the same, even though that's a benefits related type of case. It's going to be the same to the type of facts that I outlined to you here. Due process requires the same analysis. So the facts are as follows that I want you to engage. So it's in the wake of the September 11th, 2001 attacks, and Congress has passed an authorization for the use of military force, which I'll call the AUMF resolution. In that resolution, the president was authorized as the commander-in-chief to use all necessary and appropriate force against the nation's organizations or persons that were involved in the planning of or authorized, committed, or aided in the September 11th attacks committed by Al-Qaeda. The president sent the military to Afghanistan to address Al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime, which supported it. Okay, so remember, we're back in history. We don't know what happened. Okay, recently, we're at the beginning of this thing. So the case before us comes because a gentleman, Yasser Hamdi, is an American citizen. He's an American citizen, and he's captured on the battlefield by the Northern Alliance, which is a United States ally, and he's turned over to the United States military. The government claims that Mr. Hamdi was fighting for the Taliban in Afghanistan and received training there, and also that at the time of his capture, he surrendered and he had an assault rifle. Mr. Hamdi is currently being held in a Navy brig, and that holding is indefinite because they're classifying him as an enemy combatant, okay, not as a prisoner of war, because you do not have a signatory to a convention here that would give prisoner of war protection. So a habeas corpus, okay, you remember that, right? So a habeas corpus petition was filed on his behalf, alleging violations of both his 5th and 14th Amendment rights. Hamdi's claim in return against the government's characterization of his presence and whereabouts and on the battlefields was that he was actually a relief worker and had only arrived 2 months before the September 11th attacks. So we are reviewing, as the United States Supreme Court honorary here for the purpose of this class exercise, this appeals court, Circuit Court of Appeals, found in favor of the government, holding that the authorization for the use of military force resolution clause about the necessary and appropriate force authorized the government under the president's authority to basically continue Mr. Hamdi's detention indefinitely. Okay, so think of the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. Okay, so those are the facts. Okay, those are the facts. Our job is to decide what, if any, due process is constitutionally due in this situation. And as you recall, I hope, from your briefs and your study of Matthews versus Eldridge, when entertaining this type of challenge with regard to due process, the Supreme Court, according to Matthews versus Eldridge, is going to balance three factors. It's going to look at the nature of the private interest that is affected by the official action. It's going to look to the risks of erroneous deprivations of that interest through the procedures used, and also the probative value of additional or substitute procedures or safeguards. And finally, it's going to look to the government's interest in the matter. Okay, it's a balancing test, right? Is the citizen's interest high? Is the government's interest high in the matter? Okay, you have to balance those things. And you have to also look at the risk of erroneous deprivations to that interests for the individual, for example, through the procedures that are being used, okay, by the government. Okay. And as a little cheat sheet here, to help you decide the case, I put those three factors in there. And before you write up your draft opinion that you want to try to convince the rest of us of, I want you to weigh those factors specifically. Okay, you're not an advocate in this case. You're the Supreme Court. So what do you think Mr. Hamdi's best arguments would be under that three-factor analysis? What is the nature, for example, of his interests that are affected? Okay, what is the risk of erroneous deprivations of that interest through the procedures that the government is using? And then balance that against the government's interest. In return, what do you think the government's best arguments would be in terms of what is the government's interest, for example, in prosecuting the war on terror and national security, okay, versus what Mr. Hamdi's interests are, okay? And obviously they relate to due process of law, because the government is proposing to hold him indefinitely, okay, without a trial, and classifying him as an enemy combatant. Okay, so what interests are threatened there on both sides, and how should that balance come out? Okay, you have to apply these factors. I gave you a little cheat sheet to think about it. But with that being said, I'm going to leave it up to you now. Okay, so hopefully that explains, in addition to my instructions, what I want you to be doing this week. Again, you're in the position of the Supreme Court. You are an honorary Supreme Court justice this week, and our discussion would be essentially the case conference that the justices would have together to decide what ultimately their ruling is going to be. All right, I look forward to seeing what you come up with. Work hard and have fun with this. And if you have any questions, let me know. All right, good luck.